It was a hot summer, right after the 4th of July celebrations, and my husband and I were on a long road trip across the country. We were driving through the vast roads of Texas, a state often described as endless, as if when you begin your journey there, you're entering a time loop that repeats endlessly. The car carried us through a desolate desert, with nothing on either side but endless stretches of sand and gravel, and the horizon line that seemed to move further away the more we drove. We passed through a few small towns, but they were nothing more than clusters of rundown houses and old gas stations that looked like they barely functioned. There was hardly any movement to be seen, as if life had abandoned these places long ago. I had a headache from the constant staring into the pale distance ahead, so my husband suggested that I take a rest. I took his advice, watching the colors of the sunset slowly pull back across the sky, painting a beautiful canvas of reds, oranges, and purples. With every passing moment, my eyelids grew heavier until I finally closed my eyes and drifted off to sleep. I woke up to the sound of the car slowing down. Darkness had settled over the sky, and the clock on the dashboard read 10 in the evening. My husband had pulled into a small, isolated gas station and told me he would get us some food, asking if I needed to use the restroom. I did feel the need, as the road was long, and it might be a while before we found another place to stop. I walked into the small store, passing a few randomly arranged items on the shelves, and made my way to the restrooms at the end of a narrow hallway at the back. I was still feeling a bit dizzy and exhausted, but I urgently needed to use the restroom, so I hurried in. As I entered, I saw another woman exiting the only stall. We exchanged quick glances, and in that moment, something felt off. She looked disheveled in a way that was unsettling, as if she had just emerged from a battle with the wind. Her gray hair was wild and scattered around her face, and her clothing was entirely unsuitable. A black sports short, worn-out flip-flops, and layers of clothes haphazardly stacked on top of each other, including a heavy coat in loud colors, purple and green, despite the intense heat. In her hand, she was holding a tightly knotted plastic bag. I tried to smile at her, but her expression remained unchanged. Instead, it grew sharper. Her brows furrowed, and she looked as if she was holding some inexplicable anger. There was a strange glimmer in her eyes, as if she carried a hidden secret or a buried desire. A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I composed myself and went into the stall. I closed the door behind me, but I couldn't stop myself from watching her for a few more seconds through the small gap. She was standing in front of the mirror, but she wasn't brushing her hair or washing her hands. She stood in an odd way, her body angled slightly towards the door, her arms hanging loosely by her sides, almost as if she were waiting for something. Anxiety washed over me, and I quickly locked the door, trying to shake off the strange look I had seen in her eyes. I stayed in the stall longer than I should have, hoping the woman would leave the restroom. But when I finished and remained silent, I realized she was still inside. Long minutes passed, and finally, I heard the sound of her footsteps approaching the door. I heard the heavy door open and close, and I felt a momentary sense of relief. I reached out to unlock the latch, but suddenly froze. I heard breathing, a clear but soft sound. I realized, after a moment, that she hadn't left. She had only pretended to. My heart started racing, and I couldn't understand why she would do that. Why did she want to deceive me? A real sense of fear gripped me, and I regretted leaving my bag and phone in the car. I remained inside the stall, watching every movement and trying to catch any sound that might reveal her intentions. The minutes dragged on like hours until I finally heard the door open again, and this time it felt like she had actually gone. I waited a few more moments to be sure, then carefully opened the door. I washed my hands quickly and rushed toward the store. The darkness outside had become intense, and the air was thick and suffocating. When I reached the entrance, I noticed a large man talking to the cashier. I decided to wait until he left, then quietly followed him outside, trying to stay close for safety. There, at the corner of the store, the woman was crouching, as if watching the door. When she saw me, she stood up abruptly, turned around, and hurried around the corner of the building. I didn't waste a single second. I rushed to the car, where my husband was waiting for me. He looked at me, confused, and said in a concerned voice, "Are you okay? You were gone for a long time." I replied, my voice trembling with fear. "I'll tell you everything, but let's get out of here fast." When my friend John turned 18, he was incredibly happy because he had finally passed his driving test. It didn't take long before he managed to buy his first car, which was like a dream come true for him. The car wasn't the most luxurious, but it was enough to start his own adventures on the road. One day, John suddenly appeared in front of my house with his car, and he was super excited to take me for a drive. He asked if I wanted to go with him, and since I wasn't busy that evening, I eagerly agreed and jumped into the car next to him. Although the car wasn't particularly eye-catching or special, the big smile on John's face showed just how happy he was, as if it was the best thing in the world. We started our simple tour by cruising around the city, but as time went by, we began to feel hungry, so we decided to head to the famous Taco Bell. We stopped there, sat in the car, enjoying the food, and listened to music while sharing some laughs. After spending some time eating and chatting, John decided to start driving again. I sat there looking at my phone, browsing pictures, and scrolling through social media while the music played loudly in the background. About 20 minutes passed, and I was lost in my own world, but when I finally looked up, I noticed we were driving on deserted country roads. I asked John where we were heading, and he laughed, saying simply, "I don't know, just driving anywhere." I shrugged indifferently and said, "Okay, cool," and we continued talking without much concern. Minutes went by, and the sunlight slowly faded away until the sky was completely dark. I began to feel a bit anxious when I realized we were venturing further and further into unfamiliar territory. But John reassured me, saying he knew how to get back, so I relaxed a bit, and we kept driving. It was around 9:30 p.m. when we decided it was time to head back. John made a quick U-turn, and we started making our way back. After 20 more minutes of driving, John bluntly admitted, "We're lost." I was shocked and felt anxious. I had told my mom I wouldn't be late, and now I realized I'd be home late. We took a right turn, but suddenly, we found ourselves on a narrow dirt road. All the roads we had driven on until that moment were paved, so I asked John nervously if he was sure we were going the right way. He replied that he was just looking for a place to stop and think. I agreed, even though I felt there was something uncomfortable about this place. We turned onto another road, and we ended up about 50 yards away from an old, isolated house. The house wasn't connected to the road. It was located in a remote, dark area. There were no lights on, so we assumed it was abandoned. We sat in the car, trying to figure out what to do when we thought about using Google Maps to help us get back. I don't know how it didn't occur to us earlier, But the surprise was that neither of us had the app downloaded on our phones. I tried downloading it, but for some reason, it wouldn't complete, even though my phone showed the 4G symbol. When I looked at the signal bar, I found it was completely empty. John also tried downloading the app on his phone, but he had no signal either. We had two options: either try to drive back ourselves on the dark road, risking running out of fuel since the fuel gauge was nearly empty, or call John's parents to come rescue us. But we knew they'd be angry, and so would my parents, as they wouldn't trust us again if they knew we got lost on our first drive. We decided to drive slowly, hoping to find a signal for our phones. John restarted the car, but we didn't move more than a few meters before the car started to sputter and then stopped entirely. We had run out of gas. Now we were in an even more complicated situation: no fuel, no phone signal, and everything around us seemed abandoned. A third option appeared: go to the old house and check if anyone lived there who could help us. The idea came from John, but I was extremely hesitant. I didn't feel comfortable approaching that strange house. I tried calling my parents, but the call went straight to voicemail. I tried again, but no luck. John also tried calling, but he had no success either. We hesitated about walking down the dirt road in search of a signal, but John didn't want to leave the car in the middle of the road, and we didn't know how far we'd have to walk to find a signal. In the end, we had no choice but to approach the house and try to use their landline phone, if they had one. The house was about 60 yards away, so it wasn't too far. We decided to jog towards it, and as we got closer, I noticed someone standing at one of the windows, silently watching us. I felt relieved that the house wasn't abandoned, but the strange thing was that there were no lights on inside. We moved cautiously toward the door and knocked gently. We heard footsteps approaching, but the door didn't open immediately. About 15 seconds passed in eerie silence before the door slowly opened. A man appeared, looking to be around 50 years old, and he seemed ordinary enough, even friendly. We explained our situation, and he smiled, saying we could use his landline phone. He led us to the living room, where he turned on a small lamp, casting a dim light over the room. He asked if we wanted a drink, and we politely refused, but he insisted despite our repeated refusals. He went to the kitchen to get us some water, and while he was gone, we exchanged glances, and John signaled with his eyes that we should be cautious. We didn't want to accuse the man of anything, but a growing unease filled me. The man returned with 2 glasses of water, but we asked to use the phone again. He paused for a moment, as if thinking, then said the landline was in the basement. Alarm bells started ringing in my head. Nothing about this seemed right. A landline in the basement? It sounded like a blatant lie. I pretended to believe him, and told him we'd go to the basement. As we were in the hallway leading to what looked like the basement door, I calmly told John to run for the front door when I said, "Now." I heard the man's footsteps getting closer behind us, and when I felt his presence near, I said, "Now!" and we rushed to the front door. Fortunately, it had a simple sliding lock that was easy to open. We ran as fast as we could, and I couldn't help but glance back. I saw the person who had been watching us from the window still standing there, staring at us, alongside the man who was now standing at the front door. My heart sank in terror, and I ran even faster. Once we were a bit away from the house, we noticed we had a signal on our phones. I quickly called for roadside assistance. We sat in John's car, waiting for them to arrive, and when they finally did, we felt a huge sense of relief. We told the rescue worker everything that happened, and I felt much safer with him there. Once the car was refueled, we drove back home. We returned home safely and never told our parents about that strange night. It was a foolish decision to go to a random house in the middle of nowhere, but we weren't thinking clearly at the time. To this day, it still terrifies me that we didn't see just one person in that mysterious house, but actually someone else watching us from the darkness. Last August, I decided to take a road trip to Myrtle Beach with my family. The trip included my mom, my sister, her husband, and their 2 kids. We used both my car and my sister's car to transport all the stuff and people to the destination. We rented a house near the beach for just over a week, and we had a pretty good time. During that period, I was going through a tough time in my life, struggling to find steady work. I had just started 2 new jobs and didn't have much money, which increased my worries about paying my car payments and covering bills. Therefore, I decided to leave 2 days earlier than the rest of the family. I thought that leaving early would allow me to work more hours. My family wasn't comfortable with the idea of me driving back alone, especially since I planned to leave after dinner and drive through the night. They were concerned for my safety, but I reassured them that I would be fine. I told them I could stay awake all night and get home safely, only stopping for gas and food when necessary. I've always been a confident driver, and I often push through long trips without stopping unless it's absolutely necessary. However, I knew this trip would take about 12 hours, so I decided I needed to take a few breaks. I made a plan to stop at every rest area along the way just to stretch my legs and stay awake. I didn't want to risk getting too tired or sore from sitting too long. As I drove through West Virginia, it became really dark and quiet. If you've ever driven through the mountains in that area, you know how isolated the rest stops and visitor centers can feel, especially at night. Around 1 or 2 a.m., I pulled into a visitor center that had advertised fast food, and I desperately needed to use the bathroom. It was dark, and the parking lot wasn't very full. I was barefoot at the time, which is a habit of mine when I drive long distances. I pulled in and noticed that the fast food buildings were closed, but I decided to park anyway. I found a spot under a streetlight, parked, and started putting on my shoes while leaning out of the car door. I looked around, but nothing seemed unusual. After checking my phone and grabbing my wallet, I stood up to head inside. I made sure to lock my car, hearing the familiar beep of the horn as I walked toward the visitor center. As I approached, I saw a man standing at the edge of the sidewalk in front of the building. He was wearing a white hoodie, and although it seemed a bit odd, I didn't think much of it at first. However, as I passed him, I got an uneasy feeling. I glanced over my shoulder and noticed that he was watching me as I walked inside. Something didn't feel right, but I tried to shrug it off. As I turned back around, I noticed another man sitting on a bench nearby. He was just sitting there, but the fact that I hadn't noticed him before gave me a bad feeling. The 2 men seemed connected somehow, but I couldn't pinpoint why. Suddenly, I felt my stomach tighten with nerves, and all I could think was, "Nope, this isn't right." I quickly walked into the bathroom and called my roommate. I knew it was a bit ridiculous since he was 4 to 6 hours away, but I needed to feel like someone was with me, even if it was just on the phone. I gave him a quick rundown of what was going on, and asked him to stay on the line with me. When I was ready to leave the bathroom, I peeked out the door but couldn't see the guy in the white hoodie anymore. I looked to my right, and saw both men now standing next to a bench facing the entrance of the visitor center. My heart raced. I noticed the couple walking into the building, and for a moment, I felt an urge to ask them to walk with me back to my car, but something stopped me. My paranoia kicked in, and I worried that maybe the couple knew the men. I didn't want to make things worse by drawing attention to myself. I walked as quickly as I could toward my car, explaining to my roommate what was happening. I took a quick look over my shoulder and saw that the man in the white hoodie had started following me. My heart pounded, and I told my roommate, "He's following me." I tried to stay calm, but my pace quickened. I took a few more steps and looked back again. This time, the man was moving faster. I panicked and broke into a run, rushing toward my car. I had my key fob ready in my hand and unlocked the car from a distance. As soon as I reached it, I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't even look back. My hands were shaking as I put the car in reverse and sped out of the parking lot. I didn't stop to put my seatbelt on until I reached the exit of the rest area. I didn't dare look back, not even once. I kept driving until I reached the next toll road, where I pulled over and filed a report. The workers called the state police to check out the area. Even after I drove away, I couldn't stop shaking. I didn't get out of my car again until I was home. The thought that still haunts me is how easily those men could have attacked me while I was still outside putting on my shoes. I wouldn't have stood a chance if they had moved just a little faster. The whole situation could have ended very differently. And finally, hey everyone, welcome to Horror Lines. If you enjoy listening to horror stories, please subscribe to my channel and turn on the notification bell. This will help our new channel a lot. We need your love and support. I have spent several years working as a truck driver for a small company based in northern Florida, and most of my workdays have been quite similar. I would spend long hours on the road, crossing state lines with little time for rest. It wasn't easy work, but it was a job, and I was content with it. However, there is one trip that remains etched in my mind, and it's not a pleasant memory. Just thinking about it makes me feel anxious. The journey began like any other. I was scheduled to deliver a full trailer to a small town near New York City. But before I was ready to head out, my boss rushed in and informed me that I would be using a different truck and trailer. It was a last-minute change, but I didn't think much of it, as I was preoccupied with the trip. The drive was expected to take around 15 hours, with a few stops for fuel. I left around 5 p.m., hoping to arrive at my destination by mid-morning the next day. The first few hours of the journey were quite ordinary. The road was open, and the atmosphere was calm, giving me plenty of time to think about various matters. However, during my first stop, I noticed a completely black Cadillac SUV parked next to my truck. It struck me as odd since it wasn't every day that you saw a regular car in the truck parking area, but I tried to brush it off. I went inside the convenience store to grab a coffee, and when I returned to my truck, I attempted to catch a glimpse of who was inside the Cadillac, but the windows were so dark that I couldn't see a thing. I climbed back into my truck, buckled my seatbelt, and hit the road again. Everything seemed normal for a few hours until I noticed my fuel gauge dropping suddenly. It was around 3 a.m., and the darkness was thick, and I needed to find a gas station before running out of fuel. I spotted one close to the highway, pulled in, and got out to fill up. When I saw that same Cadillac parked nearby, a sense of unease washed over me. I headed inside to use the restroom, but as soon as I closed the bathroom door, I heard a knock. I called out that I'd be out shortly, and the knocking stopped. When I opened the door, I found two men in suits staring at me. One of them had a lot of tattoos on his face. I didn't say a word. I just nodded and walked past them toward my truck. As I climbed in, one of the men shouted something in Spanish, but I didn't understand. A bad feeling settled in my gut, urging me to leave the place immediately. Back on the road, I couldn't shake the thought of that car following me. I glanced in my rearview mirror and sure enough, saw the same headlights trailing behind me, about 100 yards away. My heart began to race. Why were they following me? I was certain something was off. For several hours, the car stayed behind me, never getting too close but never letting me out of its sight. As I approached my destination, the car accelerated, tailgating me and honking its horn like crazy. I knew I couldn't stop now. Finally, I arrived at the location where I was supposed to drop off the trailer, but the Cadillac sped up, cut me off, and forced me to stop. 4 doors swung open simultaneously, and 4 men in suits got out, all carrying automatic weapons. My heart raced with disbelief. I couldn't comprehend what I was witnessing. They ordered me out of the truck and commanded me to kneel on the ground. I complied, my mind spinning with fear. They began searching the trailer, speaking in Spanish the whole time. Then suddenly they stopped. They shouted something to the tattooed man, and after a heated exchange, they all got back in the car and sped off, leaving me shaken and bewildered. I called the police as soon as I could, and they launched an investigation to find out who those men were, and why they had done this. It took months before I finally received answers. The detectives informed me that the men worked for a Mexican drug cartel. They had believed that one of their trucks was carrying a shipment of heroin. When they opened my trailer and found it empty, they realized they had the wrong truck and fled before they could be caught on camera. If I hadn't switched trucks that day, I wouldn't be here telling this story. I still work the same job, spending long hours on the road. But every time I get behind the wheel, I think about that night and how close I came to not making it home. It's a memory that continues to haunt me, reminding me that every journey can hold unexpected surprises. In 2014 or maybe 2015, I worked as a tow truck driver, which has been my livelihood for most of my adult life. Towing cars is my bread and butter, and I figure I'll do it until I retire or die, whichever comes first. I had a pretty good experience with a small towing company in town. There were only 2 of us drivers, so we took turns working weekends. One of those weekends, on a hot summer night, the streets were packed with people enjoying themselves, which meant, as always, a lot of cars breaking down or getting into accidents. That holiday, it was my turn to respond to calls, which had me up all night dealing with call after call. It was late, maybe around 2:30 or even 3 a.m. I was exhausted. It had been a crazy night, and all I wanted was to get back home and crash in bed. I had already handled several calls, from clearing accidents and towing cars off the highway to rescuing stranded drivers in the city. Despite my love for making extra cash, the work was commission-based, and I was starting to feel drained. Just as I was about to head home, my phone rang again. It was an insurance company. They had a client stuck on the highway and asked if I could take the call. The distance they gave me was about 15 miles outside the city, which was farther than I wanted to go at that hour. But the drop-off point was at a nearby car dealership, making it seem like a sensible choice. I thought about it a bit. The logical part of me said no, go home and sleep, but the other part, the one that knew my paycheck would thank me for towing another car, decided I would pick up the car, tow it to the dealership, and then head home. So, I accepted the call and hit the road. The insurance company gave me the client's name, let's call her Lisa, and a phone number. I always liked to call the person beforehand to let them know I was on the way and give them an estimated time of arrival. But after trying to call several times, there was no answer. It wasn't unusual. Sometimes people don't hear their phones, especially when they're under the pressure of waiting on the side of the road. So, I brushed it off and kept driving. After about 15 minutes, I saw flashing hazard lights in the distance. I turned on the blue lights on my truck and began to slow down. But as I got closer, I noticed there were two cars. One was the one I was supposed to tow, and the other was parked directly in front of it. The second car didn't have hazard lights, which was odd. It was just sitting there, blocking my way. I stopped behind the two cars and started to feel a little annoyed. To load the car onto the tow truck, I typically need to stand in front of it, but the second car was parked in a way that made that impossible. I thought it over. No big deal. I could always load the car from the back, but that meant I'd have to put in more effort. It was annoying, but I figured I'd be done quickly enough. When I got out of the truck and approached the broken-down car, I noticed two people standing by the trunk, a man and a woman. The woman, whom I assumed was Lisa, was in her early 20s, wearing tight leather clothes, as if she had just returned from a night out. She had long black hair cascading down her shoulders, and her eyes were wide open, as if she was tense. The man beside her was taller, maybe 5 feet 10 inches, and skinny, wearing dirty jeans and a dark hoodie. He stood next to her as if they were in a deep conversation, but something about their body language made me uneasy. I approached them and greeted them warmly, introducing myself. "Hi, I'm the tow truck driver. Are you Lisa?" I asked. She nodded but didn't speak, her eyes darting between me and the man beside her. "Okay, I'm here from your insurance company," I said, trying to keep things casual. "What's going on with the car?" Before she could answer, the man interjected sharply and impatiently. "Yeah, it's just a fuel problem. I can handle it. All you need to do is take the car to the passenger parking lot, and I'll take care of it from there." This raised some red flags for me. The parking lot he was talking about was several miles away in a remote area on the highway. And besides, this was a new car, a recent model. It looked like it was still under warranty. Any issues with it should have been dealt with by the dealership, not some random parking lot. I looked at Lisa, but she didn't say anything, just stood there frozen. I was about to ask her again when I noticed something. She was no longer standing where she had been a minute ago. I glanced over my shoulder, and found her standing right behind me, so close that I felt her breath on my neck. It was as if she had moved without making a sound. Her arms were crossed tightly, her face pale and expressionless, but her eyes, they were wide and filled with something that sent chills down my spine. I took a step back, startled, and asked again, "Do you know him?" This time, my voice was more serious. She shook her head gently, but she moved just enough for me to notice. No, that word was singular, but the way she said it, or barely said it, made my stomach drop. I looked back at the man, who was now glaring at me with an expression that sent shivers down my spine. He was breathing heavily, his hands trembling at his sides, and I started to see a faint, eerie smile form on his face. At that moment, I realized, this man wasn't with her, he wasn't someone she knew, he was a complete stranger. I stepped in front of Lisa, placing myself between them, and said firmly, "You need to go. I'm not a strong person by any means, but I'm not small either. I stand about 5 feet 8 inches tall, and have a solid build." This man, on the other hand, was skinny, probably weighing 100 pounds soaking wet. But I don't know, there was something about him that made me feel uncomfortable. He stepped toward us, and driven by instinct, I raised my hand to stop him. He tried to push past me, but I didn't budge. Without thinking, I grabbed his arm and shoved him back, causing him to stumble and almost fall, but he regained his balance and stood glaring at me in anger. I turned to Lisa and told her to get in my truck. She didn't hesitate. She ran toward the cab and climbed inside. The man watched her go, then turned back to me, his smile fading. We stood there, facing each other, neither of us moving, as if time had stopped. My heart raced, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I didn't know what this man was thinking, but I wasn't ready to back down. After what felt like an eternity, the man let out a low chuckle, his voice sounding strange and unsettling, as if he were mocking the situation. He began to back away, rubbing his hands together and sucking his teeth as if he were enjoying himself. Then, without a word, he turned and went to his car, driving off into the night. I stood there for a few seconds, ensuring he was truly gone before I began loading Lisa's car onto my truck. My fingers trembled as I worked, the adrenaline still surging through my veins. I couldn't shake the thought of that man, the way he smiled, and the way he stood as if he feared nothing, as if he knew something I didn't. When I finally drove to the dealership, Lisa opened up to me. Through her tears, she told me that her car had broken down on the highway, and when she was waiting for the tow, the man had stopped behind her. At first, he seemed like he wanted to help her, but when she told him she didn't need help, things took a dark turn. He tried to open her car door from the outside, then forced his way in when she refused to let him in. She was terrified, not knowing what to do, thinking about fleeing, but afraid he would follow her, so she stood there frozen until I showed up. She wasn't sure what he wanted, but his actions gave her a bad feeling, and she had a strong sense that he might hurt her, maybe worse. When we finally arrived at the dealership, I stood and helped her out of the truck. She looked frightened but grateful, her hands trembling as she reached for her purse to pay for the tow. I tried to refuse, saying it was fine and that I was just glad she was okay. She thanked me, her voice cracking as she promised she would call her family to pick her up from there. As I watched her walk into the dealership, I couldn't shake the lingering feeling of unease that clung to me. That man, whatever he was still out there, and the way he acted, the way he smiled made me wonder if he had done something similar before, or if he would do it again. That thought sent a chill down my spine. I drove home in silence, the usual noise of the city seeming distant and unreal. When I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about that man and what could have happened if I hadn't shown up when I did. I never found out who he was, and as far as I know, nothing else happened. But even now, years later, I still think about that night sometimes, especially when I'm out late. It reminds me that you never truly know what kind of people you might encounter on the road, and that sometimes you might be the only thing standing between them and something far worse. In 2008, when I was 23 years old, I was leaving New York to head east for a corrections job. It was around 3 a.m., and the highway stretched out before me endlessly. They don't call it the loneliest highway for nothing. I hadn't seen another car or person for at least half an hour. I started to feel drowsy but not tired enough to pull over and take a nap. As I drove, I spotted a broken down car on the side of the road. I slowed down and took a look. There was a woman standing next to the car, but something felt off about the situation. I couldn't pinpoint the reason, but deep down, I felt that something was wrong. Still, I decided to crack my window and ask if she needed help calling a tow truck. When I asked her, she didn't answer my question but instead tried to open my car door. This raised a red flag in my mind. I told her politely that I didn't feel comfortable letting her into my car and decided to wait until help arrived. Suddenly, her entire demeanor changed. She became angry and started yelling at me, accusing me of being cruel and asking, "What could I possibly do to someone like you?" Despite her small stature, maybe 5 feet 2 inches, I stood over 6 feet tall, which made her seem even smaller. In a moment of poor judgment, I opened the door and let her in, thinking it wouldn't hurt. That was one of my biggest mistakes. As soon as she was seated next to me, she started asking for a ride to the next town. I mentioned calling for help again, but she became aggressive, rummaging through her purse and avoiding eye contact. My gut was screaming that I had made a huge error. Then, out of nowhere, a man appeared near her car, right by my driver's side. The situation took a dark turn quickly. I spotted him in my rearview mirror, and adrenaline kicked in. I needed to act, so I slammed the car into drive and took off just as the man reached for my door. I heard a sharp ping, followed by a loud shatter. I looked back and saw that my rearview mirror had exploded. The guy was shooting at me. I pressed down on the gas as hard as I could, hitting 90 miles per hour in no time. The woman in the passenger seat, clearly realizing that her plan had failed, began to panic. She was hitting me and yelling for me to stop and let her out. Once I felt I had enough distance, I pulled over and told her to get out of the car. She reached into her purse again, but I had had enough. Shaking with adrenaline, I opened her door and pushed her out. I slammed the door and sped off, not even caring that it was still open. After driving for a bit, I stopped to shut and lock the door properly. I felt like I was driving on autopilot for a long time. It wasn't until much later that morning, when I stopped at a Denny's, that I realized how close I had come to something terrible. I sat in the parking lot for a moment, just shaking. When I got out of the car, I noticed some of the woman's things had spilled onto the passenger seat. There were mostly crumpled napkins, old tubes of lipstick, and drug paraphernalia. I thought about calling the cops but did something stupid instead. I threw everything into a trash bag and got rid of it. At that time, I wanted to become a police officer, and I was terrified that if I got caught with drugs in my car, it would ruin my chances. As I was leaving Denny's, I saw a cop at a gas station across the street. I went over and told him what had happened. He gave me a hard time about letting the woman into my car but said he would look into it. I doubted he ever did. I never replaced the broken rearview mirror. I sold the car as it was, and in the place where I lived, it wasn't required to have one anyway. To this day, 10 years later, I still hesitate to stop and help someone on the side of the road. That night remains etched in my memory, reminding me that danger can appear anywhere, and that what seems simple can quickly turn into a nightmare. When I was younger, every summer and almost every New Year, my family would pack the car and head out on a road trip to visit relatives in Mexico. These trips were always enjoyable, and we never encountered any problems, until that one trip when I was 8 years old. As usual, we left our home in Arizona around 6 p.m., hoping to reach our destination by morning. By 2 a.m., we had crossed the border into Mexico, and that's when things started to get strange. When driving through the desert on long trips, you usually don't worry too much about the same car following you for miles. It's quite common, and there aren't many routes people can take. But this time felt different. The sky outside was pitch black, with only the stars and the occasional cactus visible as we passed by. We had been in Mexico for about an hour and a half, and we still had hours to go. I wasn't fully asleep in the car, just half conscious like I usually was on these trips. That's when my mom spoke up. "Lucas, that car has been behind us since we left Laredo." My dad glanced back and shrugged. "It's probably nothing. They're probably heading to Rosa or another city." But my mom didn't seem convinced and continued to watch the car through the rear window. By then, my siblings and I were paying attention too, but we soon got bored. Then my mom said again, "It's getting close, Lucas." She was right. The car behind us was inching closer and closer, almost tailgating us. On such a quiet, lonely stretch of road, it was scary. My dad kept his cool, not slowing down, speeding up, or pulling over. He just kept driving. For the next half hour, that car stayed right on our tail. Sometimes it would back off a little, only to speed up again, its headlights shining bright in our rearview mirror, almost like it was toying with us. Finally, my mom spotted something ahead, a police car parked on the side of the road. Without hesitation, she said, "Pull over right in front of the police, Lucas. Do it now." My dad did just that, and that creepy car drove right on past us. We all breathed a little easier. The policeman came over, looking a bit confused, and asked if everything was okay. My mom quickly told him what had happened and how the car had been following us. He took her seriously and explained that there had been reports of criminals targeting travelers on these remote highways, stealing their cars and belongings. He then offered to follow us for a while to make sure we were safe. About 10 minutes later, we saw something that made all of us shudder. The car that had been following us was parked on the side of the road, waiting. My relationship with the girl from Georgia was conducted over vast distances. I had an unmatched passion for road trips, which is why I often drove long distances to visit her. Traveling alone on the highways gave me a sense of freedom, as if anything was possible. To save some money, I opted to sleep in my car, which served as my mobile tent. All it required was adjusting the seat back, leaving the key in place, and dozing off. I never bothered to put up any window covers for privacy, and perhaps I should have. The trip south usually took about 2 days, and I typically chose to stop somewhere on the Virginia-North Carolina border for the night. That evening, I felt particularly exhausted, so I accepted the first rest area I came across. The lights were dim, with only a few cars lingering under the street lamps. Perhaps those travelers shared the same idea. I parked my car away from others, beneath a large tree, sheltered from the lights, thinking I would have more privacy there. I locked the doors, cracked the window a bit to let some air in, reclined the seat, and fell asleep. I hadn't encountered any issues on those previous nights, so I didn't expect anything unusual. Then, suddenly, I was awakened by a persistent tapping sound. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but I quickly realized I was awake. The sound came again, and I began to feel uneasy. Was something falling from the tree? Or was someone trying to get my attention? Suddenly, my heart started racing. Is there someone outside? I wondered. I sat up on the edge of the seat, feeling a wave of anxiety. Driven by curiosity and fear, I decided to take a look. Slowly, I lifted my head and peered through the windshield. What I saw was a true nightmare. There, pressed against the glass, was a face, a woman's face, pale as if she hadn't seen sunlight in years. Her eyes were rolled back, showing only the whites, and a wide, unnatural smile twisted her lips. Her long, greasy black hair stuck to the glass, as if she were expressing a desperate feeling. I was frozen with fear. What was she doing here? What did she want? I couldn't move or think. I just sat there, transfixed by her terrifying grin. After moments of paralysis, I regained my senses. With a trembling hand, I reached for the ignition key and turned it. Thank God, the engine roared to life. But before I could move, the windshield wipers came on to clear the glass, as if trying to wipe away that nightmare. But she didn't budge. Suddenly, she leaped onto the hood of my car and began crawling toward me on all fours. I didn't think, I just took off. I put the car in reverse and sped backward. In the rearview mirror, I saw her getting up and reaching for my door, but I had already taken off. Then, suddenly, I heard it, a horrifying, high-pitched scream. I glanced back again and saw her running after me on her hands and feet, her hair flying wildly. The feeling of terror engulfed me, but I didn't slow down, not until the sun began to rise. To this day, I don't know who that woman was or what she wanted, but I vowed never to stop at any rest area again after dark. Then came the time I was with my ex-girlfriend, when we decided to go camping in Great Basin National Park in Nevada. We both shared an adventurous spirit, so there was no need to convince each other about the trip. We planned to spend just one night, but we wanted it to be special. We searched for a spot far from the entrance, and found a picturesque site nestled near the mountains. When we arrived, the sun was already setting. We spent some time enjoying the view and chatting, and after hours of fun, our conversation was abruptly interrupted by a woman's scream of desperation in the distance, followed by the sound of a chainsaw. The woman screamed for what seemed like 30 seconds before suddenly falling silent. I looked at my girlfriend and saw the fear reflected in her eyes. I was scared too, but I tried to reassure her. It could just be a fox. They can sound human when they scream. But the silence that followed was terrifying. It was more than just unsettling. My girlfriend was begging me to leave. Even though I was annoyed, her safety was my top priority, so I agreed to leave. Quickly, we started gathering our things. As I was extinguishing the campfire, my girlfriend suddenly screamed, "Oh my God!" I turned to face her, and she was pointing at a large man wearing a red button-up shirt. He stood there in the darkness with his hands raised as if surrendering. My girlfriend was in a state of hysteria at that point, and I knew I had to do something. I asked the man firmly, "Can we help you?" But he remained frozen, hands still raised. This gave me a chance to take a closer look at him. He had scratches and scars all over his face, and the bottom of his shirt was torn. He looked like he had been stuck or something similar. I asked him again if we could help, and he calmly said, "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you." Then he turned and ran away in an odd, exaggerated manner. That was enough. I told my girlfriend to forget about extinguishing the fire and head straight to the car. The only problem was that the man had run in the direction we came from, so we would have to pass him to reach the car. I wasn't willing to take that risk. I said we'd find another way. The only other way was through thick woods, but what other choice did we have? We trudged along a path that felt endless, trying to navigate through the dark forest, but we were making no progress, and the idea of being lost began to terrify us both. Still, I didn't want to stop moving, as I felt that the man might be following us. We pressed on until we found ourselves at a narrow trail. Entering from a side angle, we could either go left or right. I chose right, thinking it would lead us to the car. We jogged for a bit until we finally spotted the vehicle. Something in my head told me to wait. I don't know why. It was just a feeling, almost instinctual. I asked my girlfriend to stop and wait with me for a moment. We sat there, hidden, watching the car. I was on the verge of fainting when I saw the back door of my car swing open. That same man emerged and ran off into the distance. I couldn't believe my eyes, and neither could my girlfriend. She began to cry uncontrollably. I took her by the hand and we dashed toward the car, leaving as quickly as we could. I'd never driven that fast in my life. That night, my girlfriend stayed at my place because she was too shaken to go home. We didn't talk much about what had happened, but that incident weighed heavily on us. I wouldn't be lying if I said that experience contributed to the end of our relationship, but I didn't want to delve into all that. Looking back, I realized we witnessed something far more sinister that night. I mean, we heard a woman scream and the sound of a chainsaw, and then that strange man appeared at our campsite. Everything seemed to align. After the incident, I searched for any missing persons in the park around the time we were there, but I found nothing. Even now, I still think about what happened. It was all just madness. Before I begin, I want to clarify that this isn't one of those stories that will have you on the edge of your seat, but it is a real and terrifying experience that anyone would find hard to explain. So here it goes. I have been a truck driver for various companies for about 10 years. I won't bore you with unnecessary details, so I'll just jump straight in. About a year ago, I was working for a warehouse company, delivering shipments that mainly consisted of car parts and things like that. I drove a semi, which is what I was behind the wheel of on October 8th, 2022. This incident still sticks with me because I still can't explain it. It was a chilly weekend night, and I was driving a 4-hour route to a facility in Concord, New Hampshire. It was around 11 p.m., and I was about halfway through the trip when I started feeling really tired behind the wheel. Normally, I would have had my coffee by this time of night, but on this particular night, I didn't have any. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured I'd be fine. After all, I'd done these routes and road trips several times before without any problems. I wasn't worried about it, but this night was different. I felt more tired than I had ever felt before. Keeping my eyes open on the road was starting to feel like a chore. All I wanted to do was reach my destination. I was driving down this long road in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but a field on my right. The only things around me were mountains, fields, and some small farms, nothing else to help keep myself awake. I started blasting some heavy metal music. It helped for a little while but not for long. I was driving faster than the speed limit, but I wasn't too worried since it was the middle of nowhere and there were no cops around. Suddenly, up ahead, I saw this huge explosion that lit up the whole field. I slammed on my brakes, the truck screeching to a stop. My heart was racing as I grabbed my phone to call the authorities. I jumped out of my truck to get a better look at the explosion, but when I looked at the field again, it was completely normal. There was no fire, no smoke, nothing. It was as if the explosion had never even happened. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, or rather, what I wasn't seeing. I started freaking out, hitting my head, wondering if I was dreaming. But after a few minutes of standing there, it was clear that I wasn't dreaming. I knew what I saw, but there was no evidence of it. The field was perfectly normal. I got back in my truck and just sat there for the next 10 minutes trying to process what had happened. I couldn't make sense of it. Eventually, I pulled myself together and continued on my route to the facility in Concord. When I got there, I didn't tell anyone about what I saw. I didn't want them to think I was crazy. The only person I've ever told this story to is my brother, who is also a trucker. We talked about it, but we couldn't come up with any real explanation. However, my brother did have a theory that sort of made sense. He suggested that because I didn't have my coffee that night, my mind might have been playing tricks on me, causing me to see things that weren't really there. Driving for long hours on the road can mess with your head, he said. And while we don't have any solid proof for that theory, I just accepted it in the end. Maybe there wasn't an explosion after all, but even now, I still can't shake that feeling. What I saw felt so real. It's something I think about every now and then, even though I try to put it behind me.